We were talking last time about some of the events that went on prior to the coming of Christ and the establishment of the church. I'm trying to give you some historical background for what type of society and culture they were living in, so you'll understand why they made some of the decisions they made, why they acted the way they acted, why the church moved forward the way it did. Before we really get into the history of the church itself and talk about what happened in the 1st and 2nd century, which will be the beginning, we ought to have a prelude to that we need to know ahead of time some of the background, make more sense out of it for you. So the handouts we'll probably talk about here for a little bit. The family trees, which, by the way, I noticed have not only the problem of having BCE on them, but they also have a mistake on them. On the bottom family tree, if you can scan down to 3rd row from the bottom, there's 2 men named there, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. And it shows that their father is Aristobulus I. That's not the case. Their father is Alexander Jannaeus, who's right beside him. If you look at the top, this is just the 2nd bar down from the top. On the top, it says Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus. And then under Alexander Jannaeus says Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Do you follow? That bottom family tree, whoever made it, was wrong. Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II are descendants of Alexander Jannaeus and Alexandra. The top one is the correct one. The bottom one is just easier to follow for some of the others, and it's more thorough. So we are going to be talking about the Hasmonean dynasty. They're tracing their lineage way back to one of their forefathers named Hashmon. That's why they call themselves the Hasmoneans. These are the Maccabees. When we say Maccabees, I want you to make sure you understand what a Maccabee is, because a Maccabee isn't a family name. It was a title that was given to one of the sons. Judas Maccabeus. If you look here at the top one of the Hasmonean dynasty, you see that the first person on the top is Mattathias. Directly under Mattathias is Judas. Judas was the brother who really took the war to Antiochus Epiphanes after his father died. He was called the Hammer, Maccabeus. So they essentially use that title to refer to that whole family, the Maccabees.
Wasn't Mattathias the individual that was responsible for killing Nick? That was in regards to Hanukkah, wasn't it?
Mattathias was a village priest, if you want to call him that. This whole family was a priestly line. I don't want to paint the whole picture between the 2 testaments because I want to make this pretty brief, but this whole family line was a priestly line. So they were at some point descended from Levi. Antiochus Epiphanes and his Hellenized Syrians, if you want to call them that, Antiochus Epiphanes is trying to conquer Israel and to culturally dominate them. So one of the things that he did is try to take away their religious observances. They tried to make them sacrifice pigs and everything else that would have been blasphemous, unclean. They tried to make Mattathias do this, and he wouldn't do it. And one of the villagers in the village, that he was their priest, said, well, I'll do it. So Mattathias, protecting the sanctity of God in his mind, killed the person that offered to do it and killed the soldier that told him to do it. And that started the war. At that point, his family went in as kind of a guerrilla. Like you have these pockets of resistance in a war that fight behind the scenes, or kind of like the Americans did in the Revolutionary War behind the trees and so on. They don't fight you out in the open. They fought a guerrilla war against Antiochus Epiphanes' troops and ended up defeating them. And that was what was going on around this period of time. The Maccabean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, around 165 BC, is when you really see it reach its epitome. And that eventually ended up in the establishment of a new Jewish kingdom. Most people don't even realize this. They think that the last Jewish kings were the ones that went into Babylon. There never were anymore. There were more Jewish kings. The Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, those are the same thing. After they conquered Antiochus Epiphanes, decided they would assume the kingship. They now had a nation back. They'd driven out their enemies. Israel was free. So they assumed the kingship, but they were a priestly line. So instead of just giving up that right, they assumed both. One of the family members would be the high priest, and one of the family members would be the king. Sometimes they even try to do both, king and high priest in one person. Now that's not biblical, at least not in an Old Testament sense. It went on through several generations. If you look at your family tree, you'll see that it came on down through Hyrcanus, and then Hyrcanus had Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus. Aristobulus I married Salome Alexandra. Aristobulus I married Alexandra Salome, or Salome Alexandra. He died in a somewhat of a levirate marriage. You know, the brother marrying the wife of the brother that's deceased. She ended up marrying Alexander Janneus, the younger brother. So first she was married to the older brother, Salome Alexandra. Aristobulus died, and she married Alexander Janneus, and she had a couple sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Hyrcanus II was the older son, and Aristobulus II was the younger son. Hyrcanus wasn't very ambitious. Younger brother was. Younger brother wanted more power, more authority, more responsibility. Salome lived from 139 to 67. She married the first king, Aristobulus. He died. After his death, she married his brother Alexander. It's going to get a little bit confusing, but that's why I wanted you to have a family tree. Then Alexander died. So she outlived both kings that she married. And instead of remarrying someone else, she just decided to rule in her own right as queen. Other than the usurper Athaliah, Salome Alexandra is the only woman who ruled in her own right as queen. And she did that from 76 to 67. So for 9 years, she was truly the monarch of Israel. She set up her oldest son, Hyrcanus, as the high priest. The younger son didn't appreciate that too much. He wanted some more authority and power. When Salome died, a civil war broke out between the two. Hyrcanus was just defending his own birthright. But his brother, Aristobulus, this is the second, both these are the second, was the younger brother, didn't have any right to be the king. But he wanted to be the king. Both of them were trying to find some help. It's a strange soap opera to get you to the point where Rome got into Palestine. And how did they do it? How did Israel become a protectorate? That just means you're under their authority. How did they become ruled by Rome? You're about to find out. A big and stupid mistake was made. It would have happened eventually anyway. Rome would have conquered Israel at some point anyway. But it was caused by this civil war between these two brothers. Pompey is how you really pronounce his name, by the way. Pompeii is how you pronounce the city, destroyed by Vesuvius' eruption. That's Pompeii. But Pompey doesn't make him sound so tough, does it? Sounds like a little kid with a pompadour, doesn't it? But Pompey is Pompey. Pompey was a rough, tough, ruthless Roman general. Pompey was one of the most powerful Roman generals in that time in the Roman Republic. But there was always shuffling back and forth, jostling back and forth, political maneuvering between the most powerful men, whether senators or generals. The two most powerful generals, probably of all the generals that were fighting among each other at that time, subtly fighting, not on the surface yet, were Pompey and then somebody I'll bet everybody in here has heard of. Who do you think Pompey's greatest adversary was? Who do you think Pompey's greatest antagonist was? Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was a great general and Pompey was a great general. Neither one of them had any singular dictatorial rule. They were just great generals. There was a lot of tension between them because they were both jockeying for power, and the Republican sense of Rome was coming to its end. And things were starting to fall into place that would create the Roman Empire with an emperor over it. Julius Caesar and Pompey were politically maneuvering during this particular period of time. The principal reason why Pompey and Julius didn't break loose into open war for a long time was the fact that Pompey was married to Julius Caesar's daughter. Pompey married Julia. That's easy to remember, isn't it? Around 54 BC, Julia died. As soon as his wife, who was Caesar's daughter, died, there was nothing there to keep the family from beating on each other. When she died in 54 BC, all bets were off. Pompey was putting down a revolt that essentially was in Syria at that time. He was right on the doorstep of Israel. He had no intention of going into Israel. He had no intention of conquering Israel. But one thing you need to understand about these Roman generals, what gave them more prestige and power and influence with their soldiers as well as back home was their victories. The more victories they had, the greater battles, and the more land they brought home to Rome. Look at what I conquered. The more triumphant you're going to come home. When a great general had a great victory, they'd celebrate them. Your political stock would go up. Your influence would rise. If you were jockeying for some position of power, having a lot of victories and seizing land and getting the soldiers behind you, you'll find as we get in the history of Rome, most of the time, if you could get the army behind you, you'd be emperor one of these days. Or, as you'll find out when we talk about it, if you get the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard were a nasty bunch. They were supposed to be the elite soldiers of the emperor to protect him and the palace, so to speak. Half the time, they would take the highest bidder to kill the emperor and promote the next guy. Pompey at that time was trying to position himself, and Julius Caesar is trying to position himself. And Pompey is right here on the doorstep of Israel. These two knuckle-headed Hasmonean brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, both decided to try to get some outside help to conquer their brother so that they could be legitimized in their position. So they both tried to bribe Pompey to come in on their side to enter Israel with Roman legions, kick their brother out so they could be the king. Didn't work out so well for him. It ended up with Pompey deciding that there's no way to bring peace to this situation. We're taking them both out of power, and Rome's now going to take control of this area. If they'd shut their mouths and left Pompey alone, if they had not invited Pompey into Israel, they might have still had their kingdom for at least a while longer. But they invited Pompey to come in, and Pompey said, well, if it's this much of a mess here, I think I'll just occupy this land. Come back to Rome saying, look at the nice piece of real estate I just picked up for you. Nice victory for Pompey, wasn't it? That was 63 BC, when Israel was annexed to the Roman Empire by Pompey. The Romans realized they couldn't let the Hasmoneans keep ruling under them. We talked about these two words, the ethnarchs and the tetrarchs. They couldn't just give them a position because then they'd just end up rebelling again and taking back their country. So they knew they couldn't deal with Aristobulus. He was too headstrong. So they took Aristobulus prisoner back to Rome. Hyrcanus wasn't going to cause any trouble, so they allowed Hyrcanus to continue to be the high priest, and they even gave him some responsibility. They let him have some authority in a somewhat religious sense over the areas of Israel that were the most heavily populated Jewish areas. Not all of Israel was Jewish. Judea, Galilee, Perea, and Idumea, they gave him authority over. Hyrcanus had an advisor. His name was Antipater. When the Maccabees, when the Hasmoneans conquered Israel, reconquered it, there were a lot of foreign people living inside the borders. Idumea was an example. Idumea is what used to amount to be Edom, like the Edomites. The Edomites were not blood Jews. They were not of the stock of Israel. So when they conquered their area, they didn't just kill them all and take over their land. They conquered the area and demanded that the Edomites, the Idumeans, submit to Jewish law, be circumcised and become Jewish proselytes. They had to become religious Jews. Antipater's dad, his name was Antipas. So they forced Antipas and his population of people to become religious Jews. They weren't blood Jews. They were proselytes. I don't personally believe most of these people even believed in the Jewish religion or cared one bit about it. They just submitted to it so they wouldn't have their land taken away, so they could live there, so they could have peace. Antipater had two sons, Faisal and Herod. Antipater was the advisor, remember, to Hyrcanus. The Romans promoted Antipater. He was just an advisor, but they didn't want any of these Hasmoneans continuing to rule in any real position. So instead of using a Hasmonean, they picked one of the advisors of the Hasmoneans, who was an Idumean, Antipater. They made him the procurator of Judea. And Faisal was appointed the governor of Jerusalem, and Herod was appointed the governor of Galilee, his two sons. So you can see how Herod began to be a ruler over Israel. His dad was an advisor to one of the Hasmoneans. His family had been forced to become religious Jews at least. The Romans came in. The Romans gave the authority to Antipater. In 42 BC, Antipater was murdered. And Herod was named the Tetrarch of Galilee. Rome had divided it up into 4 places, so they gave him Galilee as his tetrarchy. A tetrarch is a little bit higher than some of those other positions. It is the next best thing to an ethnarch, which is kind of like a king, but not in name. In 40 BC, Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II. Remember Aristobulus II got taken prisoner to Rome and they just left his brother as high priest? Well, Hyrcanus was still the high priest. He was high priest for quite a while. Hyrcanus' nephew, Antigonus, decided to go get some help. They always do that when they can't win the battle on their own. Decided to go get some outside help from the Parthians so that he could come in and take the country back from the Romans, as well as from his uncle. Because remember, his uncle and his dad were fighting for the country all that time before the Romans showed up. So he wanted to kick the Romans out, get his uncle out of his high priestly position, and take over like what his dad, who was the uncle's younger brother, was trying to do to begin with. He did do that. He came in and drove the Romans out, took the throne away from his uncle. There's a little bit of a colorful story about what he did when he did that. Antigonus got a hold of his uncle, Hyrcanus, and with his teeth, bit off his uncle's ears. He bit off both ears. He was mad that his uncle had sided with the Romans and he'd been the high priest. He said, "You'll never be a high priest again," and he bit off both his ears. Now, why would that be? Why couldn't he still be a high priest? Yes, Brother Lee, Brother Renz, I think, just said it. A priest could not be a high priest if you had any kind of physical defect. And they had a whole list of physical defects, it's in Leviticus 21, that would disqualify you from being a priest. And why not just bite off one ear? You know he must have been pretty mad. With his own teeth, he tore off his uncle's ears. So he was upset. Herod, remember, was the tetrarch in Galilee. Herod was scared for his life when Antigonus shows up, starts biting ears off. So Herod made a run for it. He made a run first to the east, to his mother's family. His mother's family was an Arabic family. He fled to the east, and he was hoping they would send troops back with him to get his place back and get Antigonus out of there. They declined. So Herod fled through Egypt and made an appeal to Cleopatra. You didn't realize Cleopatra was part of this story, did you? Queen of the Nile. He made an appeal to Cleopatra, who was the queen of Egypt. "I need some help reconquering Israel. You know, this crazy guy's come in, bit off ears and everything else, and I need to get my throne back." And he, after talking to Cleopatra a little bit, realized, well, Cleopatra's whole purpose, she wanted to send troops. Her reason was she wanted Israel for herself. And he realized this, so he declined her help and went to Rome, where he met with Mark Antony, and he met with Caesar, and he made an appeal to them and to the Senate to send Roman legions to help get his land back. And for some odd reason, the Senate decided to declare him and name him officially King of the Jews. That's where he got that title. He wasn't the King of the Jews before that. He had no birthright reason to be King of the Jews. No, they just put him in a governorship. He must have been pretty charismatic and a good politician. He went before the Senate and made this appeal, "Please help me take this country back." So they sent Roman legions back with him, and they named him King of the Jews. So he went back to his kingdom to win it back from Antigonus. And around 40 BC is when all this happened. And it took Herod about 3 years to capture Jerusalem and win back his throne from Antigonus. He finally became the king of Judea somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 to 37 BC. Now we know a little bit about Herod. He was an outstanding politician, clearly. He was very capable and very charismatic, and he certainly had some luck on his side because he went from being the son of somebody who was just an advisor to the king. His dad becomes a procurator. He becomes a governor. Then he becomes a tetrarch. Then he gets chased out of his kingdom, goes to Rome, and they name him King of the Jews and send him back and give him a kingdom. If you look down at near the very end of your family tree of the Hasmoneans, Alexandra, the mother of Aristobulus III, and Miriam, it says Miriam, but it's Mariamne is really the way you pronounce her name. She wanted to make an allegiance with this powerful family that's starting to come on the scene politically, Herod's family. So she had essentially promised her daughter to Herod before all this battle started. So when the battle was over and Herod became king around 36 or 37, he married Mariamne from this arranged marriage from about 4 years before. That did a lot of things for Herod, but you could look at this politically, but then you need to understand just how much Herod was in love with this woman. It was pretty normal in that society for you to marry just for political reason or for business reasons or because the parents got along and they arranged the marriage. It was an arranged marriage, but it was definitely a very passionate marriage, at least on Herod's part. Mariamne was considered one of the most beautiful women that everyone that wrote about her said she was absolutely stunningly beautiful. And Herod was addicted to this woman in a terrible, jealous way. But he certainly got a great advantage by marrying her because he was an illegitimate king who had no real right to any throne in Israel. The Romans just gave it to him. The Hasmoneans had been the kings, and he just married the last Hasmonean princess. Which means when he married Mariamne, he married into the royal line. And he could say that his sons now would be legitimate because they were descended from the Hasmoneans. Mariamne and her brother, again, were the last of the Hasmoneans. They were about as unlucky as the two jokers I mentioned before that fought each other and let Rome come in and take Israel over. Mariamne and her brother Aristobulus, another Aristobulus, this is Aristobulus III. Mariamne and her brother Aristobulus were supposed to be so stunningly good-looking, such a stunningly handsome man and such an absolutely beautiful woman. This caused them most of their trouble. Mariamne because of Herod's jealousy, and her brother. Her brother was only 17 years old, and she pretty much demanded that Herod make him the high priest over all Israel. He was a 17-year-old boy. But he was so charismatic, so good-looking, that when Herod finally broke down and did it, and they were going down the street and proclaiming it, it's almost like how Saul and David were. Saul got so jealous of David. Here's this young 17-year-old boy headed down the street, and everyone is so excited. This handsome young man, he's so charismatic. He's going to be our high priest. Didn't sit well with Herod. But Herod was upset. He did not like them praising this young man. He wasn't even high priest 1 year before Herod had him murdered in a bathing pool. Mariamne couldn't have been sure that Herod did it. But you know, those rumors start floating around. Your husband might have murdered your brother, and she loved her brother. So that was the first straw that broke the camel's back. Alexandra, the mother that arranged the marriage originally, believed Herod had him murdered. So she sent a letter to Cleopatra and said, somebody needs to do something about Herod. He had my son murdered. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra called Herod on the carpet and made him come and answer for this crime. Now, nothing ended up significantly happening. He went back and didn't lose his life. But before he left, he told his uncle, here's what I want you to do, uncle. I want you to watch over my wife while I'm gone. And this is what I want to make sure you do. If I don't get back alive from this court date I've got, if I don't get back, kill my wife. Because I cannot stand the thought of any other man with her. If I don't make it back alive, kill Mariamne. The uncle and Mariamne, at some point they got emotionally close enough that the uncle told Mariamne, here's Herod's plan, by the way. If he doesn't come back, he wants me to kill you. That wasn't the only time Herod did it. Herod went out another time. Wasn't sure he'd get back, so he got another one of his counselors and said, well, here's what I want you to do. As if he didn't learn his lesson the first time. Watch my wife. If I don't get back from this, kill her, she's not going to outlive me. Can you see a little bit of the characteristics that he had that would have caused him to kill those little babies? Yes. Do you see now why I'm telling you all these stories? You got to see it and learn enough about these men to realize that this wasn't a fluke that Herod killed all those children. It was normal for Herod. He was a terribly jealous, driven individual. His sister Salome, Herod's sister, and his mother did not like Mariamne. So by the time he gets back after these death sentences he'd put on her and everything else, and she hears about it, she's heard twice now that her husband says, if I don't live, you're to be killed. She's hearing rumors that he's murdered her beloved brother. So what does she do? Herod comes back, and she goes cold on Herod. She won't talk to him, wants nothing to do with him, and Herod, he starts to lose his mind. He can't take it. The Mariamne's not talking to him, and so on. Salome, his sister, and his mom, who hated her to begin with, start using this as a wonderful opportunity to wreck the marriage. And what they do is start to spread the rumor that Mariamne is planning to poison Herod and kill him. Eventually, Herod put her on trial for this and decided she was guilty and killed Mariamne. Herod, by the way, that wasn't his only wife. She was his second wife. He married 9 to 10 wives. But Mariamne was, according to all historians, by far his favorite. He loved her with a terrible jealousy. But he murdered her when he thought she was trying to murder him. And so he killed her, but according to the rabbis, he kept her preserved in honey for 7 years. Now, do you think this is somebody in their right mind? Now, this is the same man that somewhere in the neighborhood of 19 to 20 BC began rebuilding the temple. The temple was already there, but he wanted to dress it up. It wasn't glorious enough for him, so he started rebuilding the temple, and I think the way they phrased it, he said it was on a more magnificent scale. It's just not pretty enough. The way God designed it isn't good enough. So the temple that was actually there in Jesus' day was exceptionally dressed up by Herod. And Herod ruled for about 37 years, 34 of them after he captured Jerusalem. So that tells us that he died somewhere between 2 and 4 BC. That's the last thing I want to talk to you about tonight, but I want you to think about for a minute why that's so significant. Why would it matter to us when Herod died? According to Josephus, he ruled 34 years after he conquered Jerusalem.
Another Herod then?
There were other Herods. His descendants were Herod so-and-so, Herod so-and-so. Now do you see how we could figure out something's really wrong with the calendar? Herod started to rule somewhere around 40 BC, ruled 37 years, so somewhere around 3 BC, if you use that timeline. According to Josephus, he ruled 34 years after he conquered Jerusalem, which was somewhere around 36 to 37. So that would tell us that Herod died somewhere around 2 or 3 BC, or maybe 4. But why is that important to us? Herod was alive when Jesus was born, wasn't he? That tells us Jesus wasn't born in 1 AD or 1 BC. He couldn't have been. He had to have been born at least 3 to 4 years BC, because Herod had to still be alive. Now, the other tricky thing is the fact that Herod wanted all the children how old killed? 2 years and under. So did that mean that Herod had to have been alive 2 years after Jesus' birth? Maybe, maybe not. If that's true, it pushes the date back even farther. It pushes it back to 5 or 6 BC that Jesus would have been born. I don't think that that's necessary, that he would have had to have been alive that long. It could have been even right before Herod died that he heard this. And he was just trying to cover his bases by killing all the kids that were still toddlers, basically. He murdered all kinds of family members and everyone else. Most of it was generated by 2 things. Terrible, fierce jealousy. Fear. Fear someone's going to kill you. Fear someone's out to get you. Paranoia. That's why Mariamne died. Combination of jealousy and the fact that she's going to poison me one of these days. She's mad that I want to kill her. What's the matter with her? Why would she want to live after I die? I'm such a good husband. That's all we're going to talk about Herod, so we'll get into more of the real church history after this. I want you to get the background, though, because it does give you a little bit of an understanding what kind of characters were operating at this time. 2 or 3 more things I want you to have some good background on. I want to finish up telling you about Herod and his legacy and what he left behind. There's a reason for that. It will help you to better understand some of the things that went on during the gospel period, as well as the period of the activity of the church, the book of Acts, and what happened afterwards. If you have a little bit of political background and a little bit of cultural background, it'll make some more sense out of some things. I want to interweave all through this church history some of the political and cultural background. I want to give you a little bit more background on Herod. Then I want to talk about the political and religious groups that were extant in the time of Jesus and the early church. The Herodians, the Zealots, the Hellenized Jews, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. We're not going to talk about any of those for any great length of time, but I do want you to know a little bit about some of those. It'll make a little bit more sense out of the events in the book of Acts, as well as when we get into some more deeper church history, start talking about the fall of Jerusalem and some of these other things. I think it will dovetail, it'll tie it all together for you so that it'll make a little more sense. The history will come alive, I hope, if we get some of this background. And then I do want to just very briefly talk to you about the Sanhedrin and the synagogue. We talked last about what happened with Herod's marriage to Mariamne. Mariamne was a Hasmonean princess. It was Herod's claim to legitimacy to marry a Hasmonean. To marry a Hasmonean princess when he wasn't truly Jewish himself. He was just a half proselyte, if you will. Gave him a little bit of legitimacy from a political standpoint to be able to say he could claim the throne of Israel. From a standpoint of his title, Rome recognized him. If Rome didn't recognize you at that point, it didn't really matter. You had to have the Roman emperor's recognition or you really weren't going to be the king of anything. You'll find that happened with Herod's children. His intention for one of his sons was to pass on the kingship, and Augustus didn't recognize his son as a king, so Augustus arranged it a little bit differently. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The last thing that we talked about was how Herod had executed his wife, his favorite wife. He executed her younger brother before he executed her, and that's really what started the snowball that ended up in her death. Aristobulus III, her teenage brother. What I want to mention here before we leave Herod is what happened with his heirs. Since the New Testament often talks about Herod this and Herod that. You need to realize there's more than one Herod and which one it is they're talking about. One of the things Herod the Great was most famous for was his building. He was a very busy builder. He was always building something. Incredible building skill and design skill. Some of the most beautiful places that still are in existence in the Holy Land today were built by Herod. The fortress at Masada was essentially built by Herod. And there's many other things. Cities, entire cities were redone and built by Herod to a pretty glorious extent. But the thing Herod is famous for building for is the temple that is usually, I doubt they named it for him in his day. They'd probably be insulted that we name it for him. But what we call the Temple of Herod. The reason we call temples that, whoever built the temple, usually we call it by their name. We call the first temple Solomon's temple, don't we? It wasn't Solomon's, but Solomon's the one who oversaw the building. The second temple that was built by Joshua and Zerubbabel. We don't usually call it Joshua's or Zerubbabel's temple, but we call it the second temple. That was the temple that was in existence when Herod took over control as king. It had been in existence at that time for a little more than 500 years. Herod was somebody that loved beauty. He loved things to be top-notch. And he was very impressed with the Roman and Greek architecture. So he felt like the temple had begun to deteriorate, and he thought it should be dressed up. Now, the biggest reason Herod did this had nothing to do with his respect for God, his desire to decorate God's temple, or his desire to make it more appealing. The reason Herod wanted to rebuild the temple, the primary reason, was political. There was always an undercurrent of Jews. In fact, there was a pretty strong undercurrent of Jews that didn't approve of Herod. They didn't approve of him being king. They didn't think he should be. And one of his political moves, that was pretty savvy actually, was to rebuild their temple in a very majestic way. Very extravagant rebuilding. Hoping that they would show him more favor. Any political unrest would quell. They're happy. Look at what I did. It shows I'm a good Jew. Herod wasn't a Jew. Herod was an Idumean. But he wasn't a Jew except by having had his family forced into the Jewish religion by the Maccabees at sword point, which is very unusual for the Jews. That happened later in the church, but the Jews didn't all that often forcibly convert people. But the Maccabees did. They forcibly converted Idumea, and thus Herod's family were Jews by being proselytized at the sword point. Somewhere around 19 to 20 BC is when Herod began dismantling the temple. Most people think that Herod just added to the temple and dressed it up. What he actually did was took it apart and rebuilt it. When he was done, it wasn't really even the same temple that Joshua and Zerubbabel had built. He pretty much rebuilt it entirely. He started that around 19 to 20 BC. During that time, the sacrifices and offerings never ceased. They continued. That would have been fairly difficult, I imagine. There's a lot of legends about that whole time. One of the Jewish legends, which I don't know if you can put much validity to it, but they said that it never rained during the day. All those years they were building the temple, so they were able to build all day. It didn't rain until nighttime. Well, I don't know if God's favor was on Herod rebuilding that temple or not, and that's just one of their legends. But it was built on a large hill, which is where the Temple Mount is today, that you see the Dome of the Rock. It's built on the same location that was built on. If you saw how this is structured, you might realize that the platform, which is what it is, the Dome of the Rock's built on, couldn't be the exact same area as where the temple originally would have been, the Temple of Solomon. If you were to look at a cutaway of the topography of Jerusalem, especially where the Temple Mount is, actually goes about like this. It goes downhill. What Herod did in order to expand this out, since the original temple had probably been built up here, and he wanted to build this big platform, as you can see from your handout, the original temple wasn't even as big in terms of size as this. This is the temple proper. This is what Herod wanted to build, which is not only a temple, but an enormous agora, a big open space. This was the Roman style. In Roman cities, they'd often build whether it's a public building or a religious building, a temple or a civil building of some kind, they would surround it with all these colonnaded walls. People would stand under them and discuss doctrine and everything else around the big, massive courtyard that surrounded the temple. Anybody could come up into this courtyard part of the temple, whether you were Jew or Gentile. Once you got up to the actual building of the temple, which looks more like a fortress the way Herod built it, you see there's the court of the women. There were actually stone posts, and some of the archaeologists found one of these stone posts that were originally there at the temple. And carved into that in several languages were essentially this statement: if you were not a Jew, cross this line at your peril, because you won't get out alive. They considered the sanctity of the temple very holy, and they had these posts all around that area to let you know, if you're a Gentile, don't cross into this area. But this massive rectangular courtyard built around the temple was never there under Solomon or Joshua and Zerubbabel. This was all added by Herod. You can't see it in this picture, but the hill the temple is built on, the Temple Mount, is like this. And he wanted to build this massive platform. So he actually brought in builders that built these enormous walls and filled it in. Instead of filling it in with rubble, because eventually rubble will start to sag down. Instead of doing that, he built these enormous colonnaded galleries underneath this and built this enormous platform. So the hill goes this way and the platform comes out and down. If you look over here where it says Robinson's Arch in this corner, there's still a little bit of this left. Almost everything has been completely destroyed of the original stone that was there in Herod's time. And this wall that you can't see, that's on the other side of the picture, so to speak, is the Wailing Wall. It's the Western Wall. That's all that's left. That's not a wall of the temple. We have this mindset, I think, if you're not real familiar with Israel, that that's one of the temple walls. That has nothing to do with the original temple. It's just one of the walls of Herod's enlarged courtyard that surrounded the temple, is what the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall is. It took 10 years to finish the basic construction. But the actual work on this still was going on all the way up to 64 or 65 AD. Which means if they finally did finish it around 64 or 65, that's kind of discouraging. Anyone want to tell me why? It's destroyed in 70 AD. That'll at least give you some background on how that temple came about. Herod's legacy of paranoia. It's a short list of some of the murders and mayhem that he caused before we leave Herod and talk about his children. Y'all remember Aristobulus III, the 17, 18-year-old brother of his wife that he had murdered. Then his great jealousy over his wife eventually caused him to put her on trial, and she was killed in 29 BC. Right after she was killed, her mother, Alexandra, I think figuring that the Jews would all stand behind her, declared herself queen. She figured the last of the Hasmonean dynasty was dead. Her 2 children were dead. Aristobulus III was dead and Mariamne was dead, so she says, well, I'm going to declare myself queen. That probably wasn't the smartest thing to do when you got this maniac on the throne that kills everybody for any reason to begin with. She was very quickly executed after declaring herself queen. The fact that she declared that Herod was mentally unfit to sit on the throne didn't help matters any. Herod executed Costobar, who was the husband of his sister Salome, on a charge of conspiracy a year later in 28 BC. He suspected both of his sons from his marriage to Mariamne, Alexander and Aristobulus, of conspiring to kill him. And he took them to Aquileia to be tried, and Caesar Augustus ended up talking him into getting back on good terms with them. And they were for a little while until he found some good evidence that he could take to Augustus to claim that they were conspiring to kill him. The second time he did it, he asked permission to prosecute them, and this was later in 7 BC. They were tried, found guilty, and executed. And he named his son Herod Antipater, his official heir. It wasn't long before Herod's paranoia set in again, and around 5 BC, he charged Antipater with intended murder and conspiracy against him. Another one of his sons, and he removed him as heir, and he replaced him with Antipas. That was in 5 BC. In 4 BC, Herod executed his son Antipater, and he again changed the line of inheritance. And this final time, this was right before Herod died, this was what his will, if you will, declared that he wanted for his kingdom. That Archelaus would rule as the king over the kingdom, that Antipas and Philip would rule as tetrarchs over Galilee and Perea, and over Gaulonitis, which is where Golden Heights are now, Trachonitis, Botania, and Peneus. After Herod's death, Augustus did not confirm his will, and Augustus arranged things the way he wanted them to be. He did not allow anyone to receive the title of king. Most scholars believe that Herod died at his palace at Jericho at the end of March or early April in 4 BC. There's a reason that's important. Well, why do I care when that knucklehead died? I didn't like him to begin with. Well, let me tell you why it'd be important to biblical study. Herod had to be alive when Jesus was born. You can start to calculate in a very general way how far off the calendar must be if Herod died in 4 BC, and that is strongly agreed on as the date of Herod's death. Jesus certainly wasn't born at the beginning of what we consider AD, was he? Had to be off by about 4 or 5 years. He could have been born not long before Herod died. It depends on your span of time of how long you think it was before the wise men showed up. Now, I've got reasons for both views, so I'm not going to take a side. But did the wise men show up soon after the shepherds when Jesus was still a baby? It does say he was in a house when they showed up. Did they show up a couple of years later, and that's why Herod killed all the children 2 years old and younger? If they showed up a couple years later, you've got to add 2 more years to Herod's death, which means you'd have to push back all the way to 6 BC, at least, for Jesus' birth. So there's a couple things to take into consequence. Why I wanted you to know some of this background. Part of what they've tried to look for to base the time period of Jesus' birth wasn't just when Herod died. They looked for when there were eclipses, because they thought that could have had something to do with the star, and there were several major eclipses during that period of time, ranging from 1 BC. There were 2 total eclipses in 5 BC. So some people think that very well could have been the time around 5 BC when Jesus was born. Josephus described Herod's final illness, and it's interesting how similar this is to the final illness of his grandson. Anybody know who his grandson was? His illness is described in the Bible. Who can tell me who Herod's grandson was and what chapter of the Bible his gruesome illness took place?
Herod.
Well, you got part of it, Rodney. His name was Herod for sure. Somebody say Agrippa? Herod Agrippa the First. He died around 44 AD. Anybody know where it's at in the Bible? Oh, I put it on the handout? What in the world? Why did I do that? Well, you all are just looking at me. Now look, if you can't get the answer when it's on the page in front of you. No, I know it's just shyness that causes you not to speak up. I don't know what I put in those handouts. I'm not looking at the handout, unfortunately. Beginning of the 12th chapter of the book of Acts, he executed James, didn't he? The brother of John, who was a very principal man in the church at that time. And he executed him, and you see James, the brother of Jesus. This is confusing to people. Just 3 chapters later, taking a pretty principal role. There's another James. But James, the brother of John, was one of the most principal men at that time, and he was executed by Herod in the beginning of the chapter. Herod, later in the chapter, this is Herod Agrippa the First, got so full of himself because of some big speech he made. His little head puffed up because he made a big speech. And all the people said that it's the voice of a God speaking. They thought he was a God speaking. This is the kind of compliment they gave him. And he got so puffed up about it that God struck him, an angel struck him, if you read the passage. And he came down with an illness that is very similar to what his grandfather died of. I'll change some of the words Josephus used to describe Herod's illness, but I'll read to you partially what Josephus said. I'm talking about the first Herod, Herod the Great. This is a quote from Josephus. "The disease seized his entire body and greatly plagued all its parts with various symptoms." This is what caused Herod the Great to die. "For he had a fever and an intolerable itch all over the surface of his body, continual pains in his colon, tumors on his feet, an inflammation of the abdomen, and a putrefaction in his lower body that produced worms." That's how Herod the Great died, as Josephus described it. I did change a couple words for your own sake. Sounds like his grandson died in a pretty similar way to Grandpa, didn't he? If you read the 12th chapter of Acts. Josephus also stated that Herod was so concerned, because he knew he wasn't popular, no matter how much he had done, and all the great building projects that he built some incredibly beautiful things. But even all the great building projects and everything he had done to try to curry favor, Herod knew the people didn't like him. So he sent out an invitation to all the principal men. This is around 4 BC when he died. Invited them to come up, apparently to Jericho, which is where he died. If they would have known what they were coming up for, they probably wouldn't have attended the invitation. His reasoning was he figured nobody loved him much, and there certainly wasn't going to be any crying and weeping when he died. But if all the principal men showed up and he told his sister and his heir, Salome and Archelaus essentially, if he told Archelaus and Salome, "When I die, execute all the principal men." Now, I don't know why it would have mattered to him, because he's dead. He's not going to hear all the mourning to begin with, but he thought, then everyone will be in mourning, and it won't take away from the fact that they're not at all sad that I'm dead. So all these people will be crying and weeping and moaning because all these great men died, and it'll be like them crying and weeping and moaning for me. Obviously, Herod had some issues, didn't he? But his son Archelaus and his sister Salome did not carry out his order after he died. Luckily for the principal men. We're going to talk about Herod's sons for just a few minutes, and we'll move on. Herod's son Archelaus is the one that inherited the largest bulk of what Herod's kingdom was. When you read the story of Jesus' childhood and he comes back from Egypt, Herod the Great died, didn't he? And now they say, who's ruling in his stead? The Bible says Archelaus. He was the ethnarch. Remember, a tetrarch is a ruler of 1/4. And an ethnarch is a little bit higher version of a tetrarch. When the Romans didn't really want to make you a king, they wouldn't give you that much honor, they would give you the title of an ethnarch, which means you're next best thing to a king. He was the ethnarch of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea from 4 BC to about 6 AD. So about 10 years he ruled over that land. He was such a cruel and incapable ruler that he was judged incompetent by Caesar Augustus, who dismissed him from his position and exiled him to Gaul. That's why he was only there 10 years. He was so cruel and so incompetent. So he must have been a lot like Dad. He just wasn't as good of a politician as Dad. Dad could get away with all that cruelty because he got along so well with these powerful people. He had supported them. Augustus then made Herod's other son, Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee from 6 to about 39 AD. Rather than to divide that up among the sons like Herod had originally intended, after Augustus dismissed Archelaus, he combined Samaria, Judea, and Idumea into a new province that he named Judea. So the original Judea, Idumea, and Samaria he combined into what, when you look in your Bible in the back and you see a map of the Holy Land in the time of Jesus, you see this big bulk that says Judea. That wasn't the original Judea. That was what Augustus created. It was a larger territory. And he sent lower level governors in to govern over that, rather than to just appoint any of these sons of Herod kings. Now here's why we end up with someone like Pilate a little bit later. I want to make the connection at least for you. It was not considered a prestigious position to be a governor of Judea. That was a backwater part of the empire. So they sent low level, not incompetent, but maybe not the highest skilled governors to govern over Judea. And they had to answer to the Roman legate in Syria. They were called prefects. The 5th prefect that ruled over Judea was Pontius Pilate, who administered that area from 26 to 36 AD. And the Alexandrian Jew Philo described him as being inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness, that briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, and wanton injuries, executions without trial constantly repeated, ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty was what Pontius Pilate was exercising. Up to that time, the 4 prefects before him knew enough about the Jews to know it would insult them to bring images into Jerusalem and around the temple. On their banners, their military standards, they have an image of something, or they have even an image of the emperor. That was considered very insulting in a Jewish environment. So the prefects before him, when they brought troops into the city, they didn't bring them in with images on their standards. Pontius Pilate said he could care less what they think. He brought them in with images. Caused such a riot in Jerusalem, it almost upended him. So he finally changed his mind and straightened up. He was eventually dismissed from his position over a conflict with the Samaritans. Herod Philip II ruled as the tetrarch over Iturea and Trachonitis from 4 BC to 33 to 34 AD. He was the only one of Herod the Great's sons to rule until his death. The rest of them got removed. He died childless, and his territory was placed under the Syrian legate when he died. And then Herod Antipas ruled the longest of the 3 sons. He ruled from 4 BC to 39 AD. I'll bet you know a little bit about Herod Antipas. He is the Herod that John the Baptist was rebuking. Herod Antipas fell in love with his brother's wife, Herodias. She fell in love with him as well. They both left their own spouses and married one another. In Matthew 14, 3-4, it's describing why Herod laid hold on John the Baptist and imprisoned him. John the Baptist was rebuking him and preaching against him for taking his brother's wife. Josephus wrote that the real underlying reason that Herod executed John wasn't that he was so insulted by this preaching, but because he was scared to death, John was going to start a political revolution because he was so popular. In 39 AD, Antipas was accused by his nephew. Guess who his nephew was? We just talked about him a minute ago. Herod Agrippa, Antipas's nephew, accused him of conspiracy against the Roman emperor. That's a pretty serious accusation in that day. Caligula, by the way, which is not one of the emperors you want to be accused of conspiracy of. Maybe some of the very worst would be someone like Domitian or Caligula or Nero. You don't want anyone claiming you're conspiring against someone like Caligula or Nero, because they won't let you live long. They won't even bother investigating. They hear you're conspiring, they'll just take your life. But because of his prominence, I suppose, Caligula didn't kill him. He exiled him to Gaul. That's a good place for the Herods to be sent to, wasn't it? And that's where he died at an unknown date. And there's two other things I want to talk to you about from a political background, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the religious elements that are going on and so on in Israel. Just to give you one more piece of background so you know which Roman emperors were operating during this time, from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. I'm bringing all this up to the birth of the church at Pentecost, and then we'll move forward from there as far as church history. But I want to give you the rest of this background, what was going on, what the culture was like. There were only 2 Roman emperors up to that period of time, up to the time of Pentecost, unless you want to consider Julius Caesar one. Julius Caesar assumed the role of a perpetual dictator over the empire in February of 44 BC. How many months did he last as perpetual dictator? Anybody know? From February till when? Yeah, there's a reason. Was it Shakespeare that calls it the Ides of March? Isn't it amazing how Julius Caesar was considered this great and incredible individual? He was, as a general, an incredible tactician and military man. He was an incredible politician until he made this very stupid mistake of declaring himself perpetual dictator, very unlike his heir. And his heir did it very slowly until finally he was that. But he did it over a period of time instead all at one shot. Julius just declared himself a perpetual dictator, and he was assassinated on March 15th. That's the Ides of March. He didn't last too long. Cassius and Brutus and a number of other people that were even supposed to be Caesar's friends murdered him. They were so afraid that his rule would continue. Caesar had adopted his nephew as a son. Octavian was his nephew. He adopted him as his son. After Caesar's assassination, civil war broke out, part of because Mark Antony and Cleopatra wanted to seize control. That went on until 31 BC when they were defeated, and Octavian, the nephew and adopted son of Caesar, began to essentially be the leader of Rome somewhere around 31. I'll show you how much slower he moved than his uncle. 31 BC, he really had power. 27 BC, he started to call himself. It's one thing if someone else calls you this. He started to name himself this title. I'll give it to you in Latin and English. Imperator Caesar Divi Filius. Emperor Caesar, the Son of God. That's what he started to call himself 4 years after he became the leader. But he at least didn't do it the first month. He waited 4 years before he started calling himself by titles like that. One of the reasons I guess he felt like he could call himself by that title is because this unusual thing began. It happened especially in the later part of the 1st century, what's called the emperor cult. The emperor cult is the fact that they would deify the emperors. They considered them to be just like the pharaohs and others, descended from the gods. And when they died, they were a god. So I guess Octavian felt he was justified in saying that he was Emperor Caesar, the Son of God, because they had deified Julius as a god after he was murdered. And he essentially ruled from around 31 when he started, or if you want to use 27 when he began to use these titles. He ruled all the way till 14 AD. So quite a long time for a Roman emperor. And he slowly gained more and more power as he was ruling. He was the emperor during the time of the birth of Jesus. That's why I wanted you to have some of this background. He was the one that declared the census. He was the one who controlled the world at that time. And he was really at the peak of his power when Jesus was born. Remember, he was declaring himself the Son of God, 27 BC. If Jesus was born in 5 or 6, he had had 20 years to consolidate his power. And he still ruled another 20 years after Jesus' birth. So he was an extremely powerful individual. And that's who was ruling the civilized world during the birth and early years of Jesus. He later took the title Caesar Augustus. The emperor that followed him was Tiberius. Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37. The reason I want to give you these two is because Caesar Augustus was the emperor from the time of the birth of Jesus, to say Jesus' time even when he went up to the temple as a child and so on. Tiberius was the emperor from the time of Jesus' activity and his ministry to the birth of the church. So when the church was born at Pentecost, Tiberius was the emperor at that particular point in time. He was the son of Augustus's second wife, Livia, by a previous marriage. And he was involved in a bit of a shotgun wedding. Augustus wanted Tiberius to marry Augustus's daughter, Julia. You imagine who Julia was named for, don't you? Uncle Julius, right? He wanted to marry his daughter Julia. Julia was an extremely immoral young lady, famous in Rome for her terrible immorality. He didn't want to marry her, so it was a bit of a shotgun wedding. He wasn't very interested in politics. The prefect of his Praetorian Guard was a man named Sejanus. Sejanus was extremely anti-Jewish, and it was Sejanus who appointed Pontius Pilate. Tiberius didn't want really to do much in terms of politics, so Sejanus was exercising a lot of the power, his commander of the Praetorian Guard, and he appointed Pontius Pilate. Wonder if he did that because he knew Pontius Pilate was going to be so unfeeling and uncaring and ruthless towards the Jews because he didn't like the Jews. But like all men that don't really have the position and are exercising power outside their position, Sejanus overreached himself, and Tiberius executed him eventually in 31 AD. So there's our cultural background. I'm going to start by talking to you about the political divisions that were going on in Israel during the time of Jesus and the time of the early church. There were several major divisions, politically speaking. One of them was what we would pronounce this word zealots, but it was pronounced zealots. They were a Jewish element that was extremely anti-Roman. They would have been the ones more than anything else that would have wanted to overthrow Rome and get them out of Judea, out of Israel. You realize Jesus had two of the very extremes among his disciples. You know who they were? Simon Zelotes, Simon the Zealot, and Matthew. What did Matthew do? Oh, tax collector, all right. Well, why would that be so terrible? The biggest thing the Zealots had that made them matter than anything else, they believed that God alone is Lord, and no man should be paid taxes. So they believed Caesar was taking God's position by taxing them. If they were to pay any taxes, they'd pay it to the church. They'd pay it to the temple. A temple tax. To pay a tax to the civil ruler? Oh no. And to pay a tax to a foreign ruler? And you do realize the Caesars thought of themselves as gods, so to pay a tax to a foreign ruler that thought he was God? So how do you think those two got along? One that was a zealot Jesus had to deal with. The other one that was a former, I don't think he kept collecting taxes after Jesus called him, I hope he didn't. But one that was a former tax collector. Two of the extremes of society. They believed passionately that God would help them, the zealots, to overthrow the yoke of Rome if they violently rebelled. They believed that if they just took up swords and violently rebelled, God would back it up. They were probably going back in their minds 100 years because it seems like that happened under the Maccabees, doesn't it? Looks like God backed that up. Or at the very least, their innate gifts, that their hereditary gifts allowed them to overwhelm their enemies, whatever it might be. But there's some biblical references in Daniel that very well might be talking about God backing up the Maccabees. So maybe the Zealots thought they were the descendants. They were going to take back the kingdom for Israel. And God will back us up if we violently oppose them. They were the most violent, extremist element in the Jewish-Roman wars that went from 66 to 73 AD when the temple was destroyed in 70. They were the ones that kept it going. When there were other Jews that would have been willing to surrender to Rome, eventually the Zealots took control. And it was a sect of the Zealots that were the last ones left at Masada in 73 when the Romans finally took Masada. And rather than to be captured, I think most of you probably know that story, they actually killed themselves rather than to be captured. There was an element inside the Zealots, I'm calling them Zealots, but it's the same thing, Zealots, called the Sicarii. It's a Latin word. Sicarii is how you pronounce it in Latin. Sicarius is the singular. Sicarii is the plural. Sicarius means dagger man. You know what their role was? They were like the extremist. They would roam through the festivals, the dagger in their cloak, looking not necessarily just for Romans, looking for any of their fellow Jews that were palling it up with the Romans. And they'd stick you if they saw you associated with the Romans. So they were called the Sicarii. They were the most dangerous and extremist element, especially in the 50s AD, of the Zealots. They were the part of the Zealots that died at Masada. There's two other parties. The Herodians, they were supporters of Herod. And then there were Hellenized Jews. They were Jews that had picked up a lot of the Greek culture and language A lot of what you see in the second chapter of Acts on the day of Pentecost, all those different people that showed up, because it was noised abroad, the scripture says in the King James, and all those people showed up on the day of Pentecost to see what was going on, and they heard them speaking in their different dialects, didn't they? Those were all Jews. It mentions a lot of different countries. They were Jews that had come up for the Feast of Pentecost from all those countries where the diaspora had been dispersed to. And they were Hellenized Jews. They were Jews that had begun speaking some of the language of the areas they lived in, taking on their culture, and so on. So that was another element. I want to talk to you about these three principal religious elements that were going on in the time of Jesus in the early church. First of all, the Sadducees. The name Sadducees believed to have derived probably from the name Zadok, who was the priest during the time of David and Solomon. Or it could even come from a root word that means just ones. The Sadducees were principally made up of the aristocrats, the sophisticated, the elite of society, the most wealthy, the most connected. Many of the Sadducees were priests and wealthy and aristocratic friends of priests. There was a very distinct contrast between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Unlike the Pharisees, they believed the priesthood was the sole office responsible for interpreting and teaching the Torah, the law. The law is not the entire Tanakh, but the books of Moses. To really understand them, you've got to understand that they were both conservative and liberal. They were conservative when it comes to the Bible because they believed that only the Torah, only the 5 books of the law were inspired by God, and the rest of the Bible you couldn't take on the same level. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they took to be absolutely inerrantly inspired. That was the Torah. The rest of the Bible wasn't on the same level to the Sadducees. So their understanding of angels and the resurrection, they took strictly out of the Torah, out of the 5 books of Moses. If you tried to argue with them, well, what about Job? What about Daniel? They'd say it doesn't matter. The only truly inspired Word of God is the Torah. So you couldn't use any other parts of the what they call the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. You couldn't use any other part of the Bible to argue with them. They only would go to the Torah. So they were extremely conservative in that sense. They were very liberal politically, though. If you think about this for a minute, it'll make perfect sense to you. Somebody that's wealthy and aristocratic, and this is what's so amazing about the founding of this nation. It's the exact opposite. But somebody that's wealthy and aristocratic and connected and has all the benefits of society, do you think they're going to want to lose any of that? No. And when you got a powerful empire like Rome that comes in and you know you can't get rid of them, the best thing to do is be friends. Keep the peace. Try to make friends with the Romans. Here's another very strong differentiation between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They did not believe in scribal traditions. The Pharisees believed in the scribal traditions. If you want to see the extension of that today, you know the Pharisees are still alive and well. Do you realize that modern rabbinical Judaism is essentially Phariseeism? I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean, it's the heirs. They are essentially the heirs of the Pharisees, not the Sadducees. And you can see how they progressed even in that way now. Do you realize that after the time of Christ, they begin to compile all the oral traditions and other things into what they call there's parts of this, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and so on, into what they call the Talmud, which is a massive collection of oral and written traditions that are like commentary on different things in the Bible. That would have meant nothing to the Sadducees. It would have no value whatsoever. But the Pharisees took traditions like that and put them on the same level as the written Word of God. They said if a man of God is anointed, what he says, even if it's not in the Bible, is equal to the Bible. So that's one of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they did not consider the writings of the prophets of equal authority or of divine inspiration. This is the Sadducees, as the Torah. And they did not believe, I want to stress it again, that you could use the writings of the prophets to prove or define doctrine. They rejected the belief in angels, and they rejected the belief in the resurrection of the dead. This might give you a little background in this interesting way that Jesus approached them when he made this statement, when they were discussing the resurrection with Jesus. You know what his argument to the Sadducees when they were trying to pin him in the corner about the resurrection? His argument to them was, isn't God the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? And isn't he the God of the living and not the dead? Didn't he say, I am the God, present tense, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That was Jesus' point, you know. God didn't say, I was the God of Abraham. He said, I am the God, present tense, as if Abraham was still alive to God. So thus Jesus' point was, if there's no resurrection, how can God say he is the God of Abraham? He'd have to say he was. That's really what Jesus was saying in that argument. You know where that comes from? Anyone want to take a guess? Anyone want to take a guess what part of the Bible it comes from? Sadducees didn't believe that you could argue doctrine or you could prove anything except if it was in the Torah.
Genesis, right?
It's in Exodus 3:6. It's when Moses was at the burning bush. So Jesus used the scripture from Exodus. It would have been a whole lot easier to use Job's words. You want to talk about the resurrection? Job said he's going to stand at that latter day on the earth. You could use 12th chapter of Daniel when it says that he'll come up in his lot at the end of days and some of those other things. No, see, the Sadducees wouldn't have accepted that. Jesus knew full well that he could have used a lot of scriptures throughout the prophets and the writings that would have proved the resurrection. He went to the Torah, he went to Exodus, because he knew that that's the only thing they would have accepted. Their activity and operation was centered around the temple. This is pretty much what did away with the Sadducees. After the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, what do you think happened to Israel when the Romans destroyed the temple? There was no more temple for the Sadducees to be a priesthood over. And we don't even know when they disappeared, but they just slowly disappeared out of history. That left only the Pharisees, because the Essenes died out as well, left only the Pharisees to continue on, and that is what the modern Jews, from a religious standpoint, are today, the descendants of the Pharisees. A little bit about the Pharisees. That word Pharisees believed to be derived from the Hebrew word parush, P-A-R-U-S-H, which can mean separate or interpret. They didn't use that term for themselves, though. That wasn't their normal term for themselves. They would sometimes call themselves scribes or sages, and you can see how this was inherited later. They would call themselves rabbi. Possibly the Pharisees originated sometime during the Maccabean revolt. Josephus states that there were 6,000 Pharisees in the first century, and that they were the most influential group among the common people. That would make sense, wouldn't it? Because the Sadducees were all aristocrats, wealthy individuals. The Pharisees were common men. It also would make sense if you understand the Pharisees believed you did not have to be a priest or in a particular position to teach and to preach. They were determined to maintain the purity of their Jewish religious culture and traditions in opposition to Hellenization, that's becoming more Greek, and Romanization, becoming more like the Romans. Where the Sadducees were willing to take on some of Rome's traditions and things because we want to keep the peace, right? We don't want to lose our position. We don't want to lose our priesthood. The Pharisees didn't want to take on any of that. They were very, very tightly disciplined observers of the Mosaic Law and the scribal traditions, and the two pillars of their faith were the Torah and tradition. They believed in the law and in the traditions that they had passed down in their teachings. And they did believe, unlike the Sadducees, that the writings and the prophets were equal to the Torah, equal to the 5 books of Moses in terms of doctrine and authority. Most of the Pharisees were not priests. Unlike the Sadducees, they believed that if someone was divinely anointed or inspired in their teaching or interpretation of the Torah, that was equal or even greater sometimes in importance in the Torah itself. So they believed in what I suppose you refer to as progressive revelation, revealing more as time goes on. Now, I'm sure that made the Sadducees really irritated because they felt like they were adding to the scripture. After the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, as I told you, they became the principal class. And the rabbinical form of Judaism practiced from the first century to today is primarily Pharisaic. And then finally, the Essenes. They're not mentioned in the Bible. Most people believe that Qumran, the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls was discovered, was an Essene community, and that the Dead Sea Scrolls were Essene writings. They were very strict separatists. They believed that you had to separate yourself from everyone else in society and that you had to live in a cloistered setting like you would see the monks did later in the Catholic system, monasticism. They separated themselves from society. They did not want to be too close to anybody. They felt like you'd be ritually unclean if you got too close. They wanted to stay in their own societies and stay very separate and holy. You had to swear an oath when you got initiated, and very strict discipline was imposed on you. Celibacy was probably practiced by most of the members. And they were extremely frugal. People have tried to make parallels between the Essenes and early Christians. They held sacred meals to which only initiates were invited. So someone could say, well, that's similar to communion. They had frequent ritual purification baths. In fact, in the community at Qumran, they had these areas where you would go down steps into a pool, and it wasn't to literally clean your body. It was symbolic. You went down under the water. They were very strict regarding following of the Sabbath and ritual cleanliness. They rejected the temple order at Jerusalem, including the priesthood. They had no respect whatsoever for the priesthood or any of the sacrifices they were offering at the temple. In fact, a lot of them believed that a man is his own priest, and they all thought they should offer their own sacrifices right there at Qumran. They managed to exist for a long time in this pretty difficult political environment, mainly because of King Herod. One of their leaders, called Menahem, prophesied that King Herod was going to be a great and mighty king and was going to inherit this country, which he did. Herod was so impressed that one of these Essene prophets prophesied about him that he let them get away with a lot of things other people couldn't get away with. And then here's a couple differences between some of their views. Fate and free will, that we've been talking about in some of our Doctrine of God. Whether or not everything is predetermined and fatalistic, or whether or not you have free will. The Essenes believed in predestination. Everything is fated to happen. There's nothing you can do to change it. Sadducees believed in a complete and entire human free will. And the Pharisees believed in a combination of fate and free will. They believed God predestinates some things, and then he allows human free will as well. And then finally, one other example, the soul and the resurrection. The Essenes believed that the flesh would rise again and one day be immortal. The Sadducees believed the soul is not immortal and there is no resurrection. And the Pharisees, there was a little bit of differentiation between them. Some of the Pharisees believed that the soul was mortal, that it died, but there's still a resurrection. And some believed the soul was immortal, like the Greeks taught, and that there was a resurrection.
Predestination will come up on an individual basis or like...
In terms of the Sadducees and Pharisees, the Sadducees did not believe there was any predestination individually. I'm sure they believed that God predestines world events. Yeah. That is the way you remember the Sadducees. So you don't believe in the resurrection, you'd be sad, you see. Yeah, the Essenes, Bruce, believed that everything was predestinated to the tiniest, and I don't, that's not my theology, but they believed everything down to the tiniest degree was predestinated. It was all fate. The Pharisees believed, probably closer to the way I believe, that they would probably, I think you could probably say they would believe that God predestinates events and kingdoms and groups, similar to how I believe it. The Sanhedrin, we'll talk about the synagogue next time and then get right into the actual history of the church whenever we have another history class. But the Sanhedrin was made up of 71 men, the high priest and 70 of the elders of Israel. It was a mixed group, the Sanhedrin. The leader was always Sadducee, but it was a mix of Sadducees and Pharisees, which is why Paul could start the ruckus he did. Remember when they called him before the Sanhedrin? There's all kinds of views on why Paul said what he said. When the high priest struck him and he basically called him a whited wall and rebuked the high priest, and they said, how can you rebuke the high priest? Don't you realize that's the high priest? Oh, I didn't realize that was the high priest. Well, was that sarcastic or did he not realize? If you look at your picture, the high priest sat right in the middle of this big ark. And here were 35 men on each side of him. And there's the accused standing in the middle. They base that on going all the way back to Moses and the 70 elders of Israel. I don't know if that's legitimate, but that's what they say. And they say that after Ezra and Nehemiah restored the operation of the city of Jerusalem, that Ezra set up 70 elders, and that's what became the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin was basically their court. Up to a point, that court could pass the death penalty for anything that broke the law of Moses. If somebody committed adultery, they could pass the death penalty and take them out and have them stoned. Around the time of the birth of Jesus, that power was taken away from them by the Roman government. They didn't allow them to pass the death penalty anymore. The rabbis wrote this. It's a matter of record. The rabbis at that time wrote that they were in a terrible state because the promise of Genesis 49 was the scepter would not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh came. And to him will the gathering of the people be, Shiloh the Messiah. They said the Messiah has not come and we just lost the ability to have the scepter of authority. And that was right at the time Jesus was born. Maybe they should have been looking like Simeon and Anna for Shiloh. But instead they thought, God help us, we've lost our power. God's promises are going to fail. God's promises cannot fail. If they had realized that God's promises are yea and amen, if they'd realized that my word shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it. If they had believed that, if they really believed it, they would have been looking everywhere for their Messiah because he had to have been born. Because they were right. They lost the power. They lost the scepter. They lost the ability to exercise the most important part of their law, and that's to punish sin with the death penalty. They should have been looking for Shiloh. They were given other clues. I'll give you one other scripture, the book of Ezekiel. I'll let you find it. I won't tell you where it's at. It says, I shall overturn it until he comes to whom it belongs. That's literally what Shiloh's name means, he to whom it belongs. He's going to overturn Israel. He did. He overturned them from Babylon to Medo-Persia. That's the first overturning. He overturned them from Medo-Persia to Greece. I shall overturn it. Third overturning. That's Greece to Rome. And he shall come, whose right it is. What do you think of that? To whom it belongs. They should have been looking. They lost the scepter. There was Shiloh, and then the other scripture is directly referring to Shiloh and Ezekiel. Told them that they're going to be overturned 3 times. They were. The last overturning, they were turned into the hands of Rome. As soon as Rome gained power over them and they lost the scepter, they should have been looking everywhere for their Messiah.